distorted picture of how their revenue looks. And so there are two problems that arise. The first is many African countries collect the bulk of their revenue through some sort of border tax. Some of this is a legitimate tax, and by that I mean something acknowledged by the WTO as something you're allowed to levy. But a lot of them are not legitimate. So, Zimbabwe has been a repeat offender, particularly in the era when President Mugabe was in power, where he would just impose these additional levies. These are problematic, and they're not connected to a domestic industry. There is simply an amount that is being requested if you want to put the goods into the country. Now, one of the problems with this is that it obviously discourages trade. So the higher the duties get, the less people are inclined to want to trade with that country. The more expensive it becomes, the fewer goods people in the country can afford, and kind of the less effective the duty becomes, because the effect on most things when you increase the price is you drive down the consumption. One of the big concerns I have with the trade agreement, and by the way, I'm a huge fan. I think it's an incredibly big and important step that we're taking as a continent. But one of the things that really worries me is how do we balance the books? If we have an expectation that duties should be removed, where does the money come from for the country to operate? Where's the tax revenue going to come from? Because in many of the other African countries outside of South Africa, and some other exceptions, but really the minority, we don't have a strongly functional income tax regime. And if you can't replace the revenue that you're earning from the customs duties, then the implementation on the ground is going to be very difficult. If you can't collect the duty as a duty, there has to be another way for the money to come in. And I might have missed something, but I don't think I've got a clear understanding on how the sort of economic equation gets balanced. Normally what you would expect is you would have duties go down, but the sort of the two parties, let's say it was a bilateral agreement, both have manufacturing, and you give a concession on the one side, but you get a concession on the other, and your manufactured goods move between the two regions that have the agreement. We don't have a lot of industrialization in Africa. Again, that's a horrible generalization, but I think at the aggregate, it's probably an accurate comment. We have great potential for a good agricultural sector, and we certainly have great potential, I think, for an agro-processing sector. Probably interesting potential for some beneficiation of Africa's tremendous mineral wealth. But the plans have got to be put in place that allows the revenue to remain inside the countries. So if you think about the problem, I guess through the lens that I view it, we have some horrible behavior from multinational mining companies, for example, which are extracting significant amounts of value out of the country, not leaving a lot of it behind. Because you have a weak income tax regime, the collection ability in those countries is not good. If you can't get that right, it's very difficult to use the duties productively, for example, to get an infant industry off the ground. So it'd be very interesting to see what the incentive structure looks like. And I don't mean the payment of money for people to do things, but what is the incentive structure going to look like to set up manufacturing? Africa has many advantages. It has a young population. It has relatively cheap labor if we look at, again, the aggregate across the continent. And some countries have really done some very special things in the space. If we look at areas like Ethiopia, Rwanda, some tremendous things have happened when companies have been allowed to make investments and do some development. So I think, Ronnie, I'm not sure if I've answered your question. Let me maybe take a pause and see if I've kind of answered your question around tariffs, or if I've lost the plot completely.
Oh yeah, thank you so much for that, Donald. I think you are on the right track, and your thoughts are very welcome on that. So what I'm going to do is, I don't want to open the floor for questions yet. Please park your questions, colleagues, so that we can also welcome Tina, because I think in his presentation, it will give us a holistic view of what is it that we actually want to understand in this platform. Tina, welcome. Thank you very much for your time. And we're very, anticipating to hear from you. So please share your ideas with us, and we'll take it from there. Thank you, Donald.
Okay, thank you, Ronnie, for the opportunity.
Welcome.
It's also very interesting that Donald and I are presenting here. It's the first time I meet him. Well, I see his face, but I've had a couple of chats with him through Francois Fouché. Thanks for that information, Donald. Okay. Ronnie, are you going to be sharing the screen?
Affirmative. Yeah, I'm going to be sharing. I'm going to be sharing.
Thank you.
Sorry?
Albert, our CTO, will assist you with that. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, perfect. My presentations tend to last a bit longer than 15 minutes. So I'm going to try to go through this quite quickly as well. And some of the points, I think that with the way that Ronnie's sort of structured this, people will be able to sort of bring in the questions afterwards. So yeah, I hope you've got your pen and paper.
But take your time, Tina. Don't feel pressured. Take your time, sir.
No, fine. Okay. So we can move on to the next slide. Okay, next. So that's just our introductory slide. Okay, we move on. Okay, so this is just a welcome. This is who I am, and I think you can leave it there, clearing and forwarding. So I was going to do a bit of an introduction, but I know that Ronnie's also got a bio that he'll be emailing to everybody so that you can get to know a bit more of myself and Donald. As Ronnie has mentioned, my role here is really around talking about the logistics around international trade. And that's what I'm going to be really focusing on. So there might be some terms that some of you have heard before in the past, or will be hearing in the near future, I hope. And where I will be starting with is really on the clearing and forwarding side. What is clearing and forwarding? And ideally, clearing and forwarding is the process of declaring your goods with customs. In actual fact, that's done by your clearing department. It's done at the country of import. So clearing is when your goods arrive at the border and now have to be released into South Africa so that it can go to the final destination, be it Johannesburg, Durban, or Bloemfontein, whichever it may be. Now, what happens with the clearing agent is that you are assigned a clearing agent who then clears your goods for you and processes the part with customs where they pay the VAT and the duties, like Donald had just spoken about. So clearing is the point at where your goods reach the border and need to be declared as goods that are coming into the country. Okay. Forwarding is actually the opposite. Forwarding is the process of getting your goods out of another country. So it's when it's moving out, say, a common example is China. It's the process where you have a forwarding agent in that country who then arranges the logistics and the clearing of the goods through to your country so that you can clear it into your country as well. Duties are only paid at the country of import. There's no duties paid when you are exporting it out of your country. The duties are paid in the country that is receiving the goods. Okay. Next slide, please. Okay, so really, the whole tariff thing that Donald has been talking about really revolves around customs. Customs are the people that really that draw the money. So all goods will be subjected to VAT. All goods will be subjected to duties. Some goods are duty free, and that's why you have, you know, the AfCFTA, Africa Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, which is really there to, you know, create duty free for almost, I believe it's 90% of the products that will be traded across the continent. Okay, so customs really, no, we're still on that slide. Thanks. Okay, so customs has a number of roles to play. They have a role to collect the duties, yes. They also have a role to protect the country from dubious goods coming into the country. And that's why they'll examine, they'll do a customs examination, or a random customs examination can be done, just to be sure that people are bringing in, you know, what they are saying they'll be bringing in. And that's why they'll need a packing list as well with every shipment that goes through a border, so that they can see on the list, and actually, if they need to check and open boxes, they can do that as well. Then again, with regards to duties, you'll see on my second slide there, on my second point, it says economy protection. And what's also one of the reasons why duties really exist is that it exists to protect certain industries in a country. So if you're in a country and, for example, if we can use the textile industry, the clothing industry, where we had an issue earlier on in South Africa where, you know, goods were being brought in from Chinese manufacturers at a cheaper rate than our own industry can produce those goods. And what that actually ends up doing is that it kills an industry within a country. And that is why you'll see certain duties will be placed. The vehicles, for example, is a good example. If you want to buy a car in South Africa, but you want to buy it from outside of South Africa, you'll be charged very serious duties. I think it's above, but I know it's above 40% duties. And that's because we have our own vehicle manufacturing industry. Okay, so we'll move on again to customs stops. Customs stops exist. Some of you, if you do imports, may have had this happen to you. And it's really, they happen if customs is suspicious of your import. Doesn't mean that anything is necessarily wrong, but they may open your package, they may look through your package to see that what you're declaring is what it is. And one of the things that sort of rings an alarm bell for them is when people declare very small values for duty for products. So, you know, first people will bring in, you know, 10 pairs of shoes and say each of those shoes are valued at $1. You know, even a person could be doing that because it's samples, but for those reasons, it will make customs be suspect. They would assume a shoe that costs $1, I mean, doesn't make much sense. And for those reasons, they may examine it. They may contact your supplier. They may visit your supplier's websites, even ask for catalogs to see if this pricing that you have on your commercial invoice correlates with what they sell. Okay, so now we've moved on to Incoterms. Incoterms are a very important thing to understand in shipping because it determines who's responsible for the shipment at which point. So it's a legally binding contract between the buyer and the seller, and it's published by the International Chamber of Commerce. And why it's so important is firstly, it determines where that shipment is your responsibility. So if anything was to go wrong with that shipment, when would you then be responsible, or would your supplier be responsible? And those are terms that are agreed between you and your supplier. And effectively, from an import level or from an export level as well, your Incoterms determine your total landed cost and your total. So you need to be able to price your product. If you now, you get into a space where you're exporting to Namibia, you need to know what the cost of that product is after you've exported it and it's arrived at the buyer's manufacturing plant or whatever it may be. But in other cases, you need to know how to then price your product. Now, your Incoterms are going to inform you of which part of the logistics is your responsibility. So a quick one would be a DDP shipment, so X works to DDP, where you are in charge of the entire shipment. So you are in charge of the road freight. You are in charge of sea freight if there needs to be sea freight. You are in charge of declaring, paying duties into that country as well, which is DDP, which is delivered duty paid. So it's very important. And I can move on to the next slide, and I'll just show you an example of what Incoterms look like. Okay, so I don't know if you're able to sort of see there very clearly, but I'm happy to share the slide with everyone. If you look at towards the bottom of the table, you can see on the left-hand side, you've got charge fees, then packaging, loading charges, then it goes down delivery to port or place. You've got export duty, taxes and security clearance, original terminal charges, loading on carriage. So everything is listed that will take place between the process of when the product is leaving its the exporter to the importer. And then on the right-hand side to all those rules, you can then see who's responsible, buyer, seller, sort of, it splits them up. And then if you just move your eyes further up to the green column, where you'll see EXW, FCA, FAS, yes, that's correct. Those are the Incoterms. So EXW, right below it, you can see is X-Works. I had mentioned DDP just now in my example. That's the furthest one to the right. DDP, and is written below it, delivered duty paid. So in all your interactions or with a buyer, or if you are the importer, you're importing, you need to be clear on the Incoterms so as to understand when you are responsible for that shipment, because it affects your price, and if there's costs involved, that cost is belongs to you. So if you are doing shipping, it's very important. I think the only time where Incoterms don't really apply is if you use courier, because courier is a door-to-door service, even internationally. So in that case, Incoterms don't really take place. Okay, can we move on to the next slide? Okay, so we'll just look at the various modes of transport. I've already mentioned a couple. We've got sea freight, which is really done for your larger shipments. They have longer transit times, but they deal with full container loads, which are your 6-meter containers, your 12-meter containers, also known as 20-foot to 40-foot containers. But they also can deal with LCL, which is not a full container, less than full container load. And that's if you're bringing in shipments which are basically, say, 1,000 kgs. They don't fill up a full container. So what they'll do is they'll co-load into one container with other people's shipments. So that's also done as well. Some of the things that happen with sea freight are port delays as well. We've heard here in South Africa, Port Elizabeth has had issues there. The Durban port is not functioning at optimal levels. But yeah, that's sort of sea freight side. And then you get your air freight and courier, which is light and faster items. Air freight, for some people don't know this, but air freight does take containers. The air freight does take 20-foot and 40-foot containers as well. But courier is ideal for your lightest items less than 150 kgs. And these are most effective for e-commerce as well. Road freight, the one most used in Africa trade. And this is done nationwide and often what's known as cross-border trade. That's when you're trading with Lesotho, Namibia, your neighboring countries. They use most of the time with super links that are being used, 33-ton trucks. And one of the things that sort of arise, there's a risk of theft that we've sort of placed there, where these shipments go into other countries, and there's a risk of theft that happens where the trucks get hijacked. One of the other things as well would be the delays at the border as well, which is something that Donald had sort of touched on, and where the process of clearing and the acceptance of permits between countries can sometimes cause delays. It's been seen quite often where a client, say out of South Africa, is exporting, and has met all the requirements from the South Africa side and is under the impression that they've met all the requirements on the receiving country side. And when the goods then get there, they are then given new information. And these are the type of things that can cause delays at the borders, which can take, I've seen trucks sit there for 7 days or even beyond 7 days. And then there's rail. Rail is really for commodities and minerals, ideal for moving things direct from mine to port. So we've got a very strong railroad route that goes down to Richards Bay. And 80% of Africa's total rail infrastructure is actually run by Transnet. So that's one of the interesting things that we're not very familiar with. And then can we move on to the next slide? Yeah, so these are the times when people are sort of moving towards globalization, thinking about e-commerce and, and it's taking up. You can see it now, even with the coronavirus, malls getting shut down, everyone trying to sort of do more delivering. And South Africans really need to be driving towards, looking at a global perspective. And that's what the AfCFTA exists for. It exists to strengthen, the continent as a continent, the economy as a whole, and increase trade within Africa, across African states, and also, with the stronger the African continent becomes, then the more trade that will take place between other continents as well, like Mr. Mukoki had mentioned 2 weeks back at the session. So what's really important, it's online, it's very demand driven, and you need to be able to meet your client's demand. And e-commerce at the moment is all about being able to, it's about who gets it there the fastest with the ease. So if you say I'm going to deliver in 3 to 5 days, then deliver in 3 to 5 days. If you're going to have problems with custom stops and you're running an e-commerce business, you might just find your business failing due to those custom stops or processes that do not allow you to meet the timeframes that your clients want. So it really involves a good freight distribution strategy and a warehousing strategy. A lot of you, if you look at your Take-A-Lot will tell you they've got products from all over the world, but they've got massive warehouses as well. And that's why they're able to deliver within 1 to 3 days or 3 to 5 days to certain areas all over the country, because they've got strategic warehouses that have been placed in those areas. So it's important to have a reliable courier and a road freight network with e-commerce, okay? So really trade agreements become very important. You look at the South African Customs Union, SADC, the EU-SA Free Trade Area, and then the Africa Continental Free Trade Area Agreement. So I'm just going to be going into looking at SADC and the AfCFTA. Next slide, please. Okay, so SADC alone contains a population of 345 million people. In 2018, they had a GDP growth of 1.8%, which 23% contribution of that was made up by women. The services sector contributed 59.4% of GDP. Industry contributed 20.3% of GDP, and agriculture did 20.2% of GDP. Can move on to the next slide. Yeah, so the purpose of forming SADC was to reduce dependence on the previous apartheid SA. So they wanted to create a genuine regional integration between the countries that form up of SADC. And it was around the mobilization of member state resources. How can we all work together to strengthen each other as a regional economic community? So they wanted to secure international cooperation, and really their mission is to promote sustainable and equitable economic growth and socio-economic development for all countries involved. And it really evolved on a common political values and systems. And it's about maximizing the utilization of resources. And yeah, all members are still sovereign and equal member states. So just to make you understand quickly, there's what you call a customs union. And the customs union, which is what SACU is, and what the difference is that a customs union is able to trade with other countries as a customs union. So they can have the same duties and tariff book for all countries that are part of that union. And if they wanted to now decide trading terms with, let's say, the UK or China, that decision could be made collectively. Whereas with SADC, which is not a union, South Africa can still go trade, whilst say Botswana is not able will have different trade terms with another country. Okay, so can we move on? Okay, so we look at the Africa Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, and this really came about on the 30th of May, 2019, and adopted alongside the BIAT. And it's really a trade policy that's there for trade facilitation, productive capacity, creating infrastructure, finance, trade info, and market integration. Next slide, please. So it really consists of 55 member states, I believe, and a total of 1.2 billion people. It's got a growing middle class at the moment and a combined GDP of $3.4 trillion US, and effectively will be the world's largest free trade area. Okay. Ideally, they're looking to boost intra-Africa trade by 52.3%. And this is with the 1.2 billion people. And they want to accelerate the establishment of a customs union. I've just explained recently what a customs union is, so that now they can trade as a union, just like you had, well, now that Brexit's taken place, but the European Union as well. And that's why you have the EU-SA Free Trade Area Agreement. It's an agreement we have with the whole of Europe, not one individual country. And they want to create better harmonization of regional economic communities. So you've got all over Africa, you've got different trade agreements. You've got SADC, which is in the south. You've got the Common Market for Eastern Africa, COMESA. So they want to really integrate all of these different trade agreements that exist within Africa and create one free trade area. Okay, we can move on to the next slide. The operational phase launched 7 July, and it's a coordination of African Union Commission and regional economic communities, Parliament, civil society, and private sector to be mobilized. They're looking at 90% of products to be liberalized, and finalization deadline was actually June 2020, and we aren't there. So because today we're really talking around, there's a lot of focus on the AfCFTA, I'm just going to chat a little bit here from a logistics perspective. One of the things that Donald had mentioned with his concerns would be the really coming to the harmonization of all these duties. How do you take, if you take away these duties, a lot of these countries are not manufacturing countries, so they draw money from these duties. So if you now are going to say that, everything's going to be free, how do you replace that income? And then the other aspect that we need to then really get a grip on is, from a logistics perspective, is the synergy in terms of the clearance, the synergy between nations of declaring goods, so that they can be cleared into other countries. It needs to be there. It needs to be efficient for the AfCFTA works to becomes what we have sort of all hoped for it to be. And as a result, I would just like to say, for South African entrepreneurs or business, the AfCFTA is an exciting prospect, but it is not something that needs to be waited upon before everything becomes finalized. We already have trade agreements with other countries. Exports is a big opportunity, and it contributes to our GDP significantly. And as South Africans in general do not have an export or even an import mind, but as soon as you chat to them, they're more interested in, okay, what can I import so that I can resell to other South Africans? When what we should be thinking is, what can I sell to other countries? And because, you look at the fact that we are in a recession, our economy hasn't been doing great, you're now getting a piece of a bigger pie when you start trading internationally. So the AfCFTA is a great initiative. It will come to, it revolves politics, it revolves production capacity of different countries, it involves the harmonization of policies, and it also involves the buying in of all people. And so it may take some time for it to actually really be finalized. And as a result, it should not be viewed as something that is the opening or the gateway to international trade. It's a benefit, it's a cherry on top. but the cake is still there. International trade opportunities are there. Exports are happening. Yes, you do get customs stops. Yes, some border delays, but it's not on every single shipment. And these things can be avoided. Well, the better, you know, the more the more better harmonized things become. And that's what the AfCFTA as well will sort of create. Okay. Yeah. So I think, yeah, we can move to the next. Okay. So yeah, I'm just going to go through these last few slides rather quickly. If you want to be an exporter, it's very important that you can create export marketing plans. And the export marketing plans is really around what's your current situation as a business, what's your export readiness, your product, what's your product exportability? Has it been, you know, been through the relevant bodies to pass it? And what are the opportunities and threats that are posed by the external environment, the export market you're looking at? Okay. And what are your export objectives? What's your vision? What's your export vision? And what's your plan to develop your export market? And who's your target export market? And what's your market entry strategy? Okay. And here again, you involve your pricing strategy, you involve your distribution strategy, your promotion strategy, and you also sort of put together a budget. Now, the importance of an export marketing plan is because the South African government knows very well how important exports are to our country, and they also know how much we aren't. We're not maximizing our exports. In fact, we're far from maximizing our exports. So there's a lot of support throughout the Department of Trade and Industry. When you have your export marketing plan, you put these kind of things together. It then becomes, you know, very possible for you to get funding, for you to then go and put your product and have it marketed in an export market. Okay, thank you. Next slide, please. Yeah, so then it's all about market identification and a few things you need to think about. What are the language barriers? So you want to export your market, you've got a product and you really want to get it into another country, but they speak French in that country. What kind of problems is that going to give you? What's the culture of the people? What's your total landed cost once that product is there? What's it going to cost you to do your primary and secondary research? And you look at your stats on electronic, that I'll show it at the end as well. Okay. Yeah, so that's really the end of my presentation. Ronnie, I just wanted to just show a few stats that I'd sent through. I think we can start with I actually don't mind whichever one of the three you start with, but just to show a bit of information on what the trade is really like between South Africa and Africa. You know, that trade map bilateral, I don't really mind. Yeah, so this is current stats. Basically, what's the trade between South Africa and Africa? Which are the biggest products, the highest number of products that are sort of being sold out there? So South Africa's exports to Africa, you can see mineral fuels, mineral oils, and products of their distillation are the highest exports that South Africa sends to the whole of Africa. You can also see machinery, mechanical appliances comes in. Third, you've got vehicles and other railway, then iron ores and slash, and then you've also got electricity, machinery and the likes. And then if we just move back to the top, I think what's important to look at is to see the trend. And if you see all products, you can see in 2017 this is in US dollars, so it's 108,000. If you look at the total, the first line, all products, so the value in 2017, so that's 108,000. So that's 601 million, 108,000. So it's 23 million. 108,000, 601 million, 23 billion, 601 million, 108,000 US dollars. So it's a massive amount. And that was a Zuma moment there, but I think I managed to get my pride back at the end. Okay. And then what we want to look at is, you look at 2018, you can see that there was a slight growth there as well, and then slight dip again in 2019. But there's quite a lot of different trade there as well. Now I want to just show you, we can look at the other countries now as well. I think I've got Namibia and Lesotho on the other slide.
I'm getting you Lesotho.
Okay, Lesotho. So here again, we've got all products. And I want, in this slide, what I really want us to focus on is, I'm not going to go through the different products as per se, as you can see them there on the side, which are the highest numbers, but what we want to look at is all products, that first line. Now, you can see the trades has remained sort of rather neutral since 2017, 2018, it's remained at sort of the same. But what you want to see is what does Lesotho import from the world on the next, sort of next to that. So you can see Lesotho's imports from the rest of the world in 2018 was 1,539,427. And their imports from South Africa was 1,327,078. I mean, that accounts to more than 80% of their imports are coming out of South Africa. So, you know, this just shows you that, I mean, this is a landlocked country, but this also just shows you that, you know, the trade is happening. It's there. And the opportunities are there, but South Africans, you know, just need a bit of a mind shift because we really are supplying others. I wanted to look at Namibia as well to show you this, just to show you an example as well of a country that's not landlocked. So there again, Namibia is not a landlocked country to South Africa, but if you look at their all products, the same example that we just sort of did with Lesotho, you can see that these guys are doing about 50% in some years, just below, maybe between 40 and 50% of their imports are coming from South Africa. So there's the trade between South Africa, SADC countries, and Africa is there, and there are opportunities, you know, definitely out there for South Africans and other Africans to trade with South Africa. And that's really what the AfCFTA is out there to do, is to create ease of trade between and harmonization through your borders. How do we have our similar customs processes to declare our goods so that we don't have as many customs stops or customs delays? And how do we boost trade between all countries in the continent in order to create a stronger continent? That's what the Africa Continental Free Trade Area is about. And yes, to be a lovely thing to see it realized. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tina, for a very insightful and helpful presentation. I think whilst you colleagues are preparing your questions, I'm going to set the scene by asking each one of you a question. And the first one for you, Tina, is around the ease of doing, this exports and imports on the continent. As we've seen in terms of the trade facilitation agreement, there needs to be, the one window theory where you go, it's a one-stop shop, you go, you get everything done there. And also, of course, the information needs to be published for each country if you want to have access to that information. So is that happening on the continent? How easy is it to do it compared to other jurisdictions in the world when you want to move your goods? And what do you think would improve and make it even much more easier than I can imagine it currently is? And then for you, Donald, for the first time I realized why usually when we have trade discussions we have lawyers and economists there, because we're good with giving the framework and the economists will be telling us on the other hand the whole time, from an economic perspective. I mean, you really hit at the heart of what sacrifices, if you may, would have to happen insofar as erosion of revenue. Effectively, as you mentioned, when you remove the tariffs, it means there's no more income for these countries. So how realistic is it that we all know that the AfCFTA was supposed to be rolled out in July this year, and that obviously is in suspense now. And the ambition now is to have that going starting next year sometime. And of course, we know that, it's a process and there's windows in terms of when certain things should happen and so forth. So how realistic is it that we would be able to achieve, complete, not even no, tariffs at all, but that we would actually be able to harmonize and make sure that the incentives you're talking about are actually there for countries to benefit from. So Tina, I'm going to ask you to go first, and then you may come in, and then the floor is now open for questions, colleagues. Thank you so much. Tina.
Okay, so my question is really around the ease of logistics in Africa. If I shortened it nicely there for you, Ronnie. So really, when it comes to Africa, trading with other African countries, there's certain things that you need to be sort of aware of. One of the things that sort of apply, well, not just to African countries, anything, is that you would want to have agents in the other country, in the receiving country. So you have an agent there that is equipped to handle road freight in that country so that those goods can get to their final destination. Now, when it comes to Africa, what we've experienced and what you've got to be aware of is the in some countries you've got a lacking infrastructure. Systems are not as advanced as what you'll find in Europe or the US and other countries, or Asia for that matter. And as a result, a lot of logistics companies prefer to ship on an ex-works to CIF basis if they're going to handle the majority of the logistics, and that was the Incoterms that I just quoted there. Because, you know, like we've mentioned, the theft that sort of exists, if you are now dealing with an agent that is placed in that is not very well equipped, you could have now goods that are stuck in a country that you are not very familiar with. You're not very familiar with the roads, but that shipment is still your responsibility. Whereas when you look at your European or your American states, their systems are more advanced. Their road freight network is quite advanced, and as a result, you tend to find that you have less of those delays. Otherwise, in general, dealing with Africa and from a trade perspective, also with the borders and the clearance of into African states is not as advanced. Their customs departments are not as advanced and as efficient as some of your African, your Asian, or Australasia for that matter. And these are the things to be aware of. So on my side, if you're dealing with a client in Africa, most cases, if they want you to do the shipping, do ex-works to CIF, which means you'll be responsible for the shipment until it reaches the port in that country, be it sea freight or air freight. This is obviously now in the further countries, it's not just cross-border, because if it's cross-border, then the truck is yours, you've put it out, and then you'll do the whole leg really. And yeah, that's what you've got to sort of be aware of, are the delays, the ease of doing customs processes and clearances. And also you need to have a strong agent that's got, a reliable agent that you can rely on, that will please your client or you.
Can you please speak up on your question there? Thank you.
Yep, sure. So let me, I'm not muted. All right. So let me kind of go through my thoughts on implementation. I think a frustration I've had with the whole trade agreement from the very beginning is a little bit like the insurance salesman who's aggressively selling you an insurance policy, but when you actually lodge a claim, you never get paid out. And I think the marketing of the trade agreement doesn't really reflect a reality. So for example, we keep talking about the agreement is going to be implemented. But when we're really honest about it, the big parts of the agreement, the things that are going to make a difference to trade, are a very long way from being implemented. So we have to harmonize these duties, and bear in mind, this is the biggest, when concluded, finally, this will be the biggest trade agreement the world has ever had, certainly the most amount of countries, if not the largest economic value. And it takes a really, really long time for even agreements a lot smaller than this to be concluded to the point where they're implemented. So I think it's politically expedient to talk about this agreement like it's a done deal. And I've been reading, even recently, since just the terrible stuff we have to deal with under COVID, you keep reading these newspaper articles, if only COVID wasn't here, this agreement would be implemented and goods would be flowing. It's a factual inaccuracy. we're nowhere near having agreement, for example, between the countries on the duties. And forget about what I'd said earlier, even around whether how let's just assume you could even get to agreement on the number. Forget about if the number that you get to is a reasonable number, but to even get to that point is difficult. You know, if you look at what was happening before this agreement, we had the tripartite the tripartite agreement, which was attempting to bring together SADC, the East Africa Community, and COMESA. And all that really happened there was some very expensive meetings with people flying to and fro, but really going absolutely nowhere. So, you know, the inclusivity of industry in this process is very close to non-existent. So if you're going to make this work, in my view, we've got to set aside the kind of the visuals and the marketing of this. And at some point, we have to get to the hard discussions and be honest about them. And my take on this is that, you know, we've got to ask the question, why is it we have the SADC Free Trade Agreement? We've had the SADC Free Trade Agreement since 2000. Why are all these SADC countries not trading with each other? You know, we essentially have no duties for 99% or thereabouts of the goods out of SADC into South Africa. You should theoretically be able to move goods freely between Zambia and Zimbabwe, etc. Yet the SADC countries, for the most part, don't really trade with each other. They do a lot more trade with the rest of the world. That's a simple example. If you go to West Africa and you look at ECOWAS, Tiger Brands made an enormous investment into that region with a poor understanding of how that trade agreement worked, with the understanding that they could buy this flour mill, and you would be able to move product duty-free between these ECOWAS countries. And even though on paper that was the case, in reality, that isn't how it works. And so those markets that they viewed on paper as being valuable markets were kind of unobtainable in reality. And I think those conversations are not the conversations we're having right now, because I think it's not expedient. Nobody really wants to talk about the fact that every African country wants to export, but nobody wants to have any imports into their country. You want imports insofar as you can collect, but you're not creating an environment where it's attractive to put up a factory. You know, if you've been to the DRC, you know, it's sitting on some of the world's largest mineral wealth, but people are not beating down the door to set up you know, a steel factory in the DRC. Although interestingly, by the way, they got a fairly large investment in a cement plant out of Pakistan, which I thought was very interesting. But for the most part, if we're going to get to the point where the trade agreement works and it's not a convenient talking point between politicians, then there has to be a greater involvement of industry. So, you know, one of the bugbears I've had, I've been very open, I've had many conversations with the DTI, is that if we're going to make this trade agreement work, and I think it's essential that we make it work, then we have to incorporate industry in a meaningful way into this process, which means we don't do what we do now. You know, right now what happens is the negotiators talk with each other with almost no input from industry. And if you're in South Africa, what happens is you're channeling your views through a body like NEDLAC. So let me kind of give you a real example that we're involved with right now, without naming names. But I got a panicky phone call from a client. I had written an article about the trade agreement. It's maybe 2-3 years ago, and he calls me and says, "Look, this is a problem because Egypt, which would of course be part of this trade agreement, has subsidies in their oil sector, and so chemicals that flow out of the oil sector are unusually cheap out of Egypt." And so he says, "Look, I'd like to have a say in you know the few tariff codes that affect the chemicals that he manufactures in South Africa." And so here's the process that unfolded. I contacted the DTI and we meet with the team and they go, sure, we'd love to incorporate this. The problem is it has to go to NEDLAC. You know, unofficially, you can kind of hand us some documents. It's handy to know, but it's got to go through NEDLAC. Well, things get really interesting at this point because that channels it through BUSA, but not everyone belongs to BUSA. And BUSA is kind of a collection, Business Unity South Africa, sorry for, I shouldn't be using these abbreviations. It should be channeled through Business Unity South Africa. And then as members of BUSA, you will have the different producer associations. So one of them is the Chemical and Allied Industries Association. And then within there's another association which relates to coatings and paint manufacturers. And this company, which is a large chemical company, it's not a Sasol-sized business, but it is substantial, is not a member of any of these associations. So all of the conversation that had been happening happened without his knowledge that those conversations were even occurring. There's simply no way for him to enter the conversation. So the end result of all of this was for him to be heard, he had to join an association and give his input. But the story gets even more complicated. So the chemical association is dominated by two companies, which is AECI and Sasol, which are obviously South Africa's, by far and away, our largest chemical producers. Anyone competing with them struggles to get their voice heard because the association has to consolidate all of the comments. So the problem we've got is
Sure,
I need to keep quiet.
Okay. Donald, can you hear me now?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
I can hear you now.
Okay, sorry. We had some audio disruptions there. Do you want to finish your point, please?
Yeah. So I think the who companies trade, governments don't trade. Yeah, you get the environment. But once you've created the environment, the governments really need to get out of the way, outside of enforcement of whatever the rules are. The problem we have at the moment is the trade agreement, to me, feels overly political and not commercial enough. So the people who are going to do the trade, the guy who is going to set up the factory, is not at the table. The people at the table are politicians, and the people at the table are government bureaucrats who are doing their best, and I'm not criticizing them, but they're doing it with very little information. And I think if we want the agreement to work, the people that need to be talking are the guys that are going to send the goods across the border. Those are the guys you want to get their views, and you want to understand what their take is. And I think you want to hear less from the politicians, because no politician is coming out and saying, look, we're worried about this agreement because how on earth is Burundi going to fund their economy if this trade, that conversation is not going to happen, because that's an awkward conversation to have. But if you can't have those conversations, I find it very difficult to understand how we make the agreement work.
Wow, some very, very serious inputs there, gentlemen. Colleagues, Gwena, I think you are the first to have your hand up. Can you ask your question, please? I'll take 3 questions, colleagues, and then, or maybe let me say 4, 2 for each, and then I'll open the floor for discussion. Gwena?
Yeah, thank you, Ronnie, for this session. My name is Reginald. I'm from Transit Engineering. We manufacture, stock, and supply to the rest of the continent, which is in the form of locomotives, passenger coaches, and freight wagons. And somehow I sit in the committee that has been neglected to pave a way on making South Africa a manufacturing hub for rolling stock. Frustrating as it is, can you hear me?
We can hear you fine. You can continue. Both the panelists.
I think. Say again, Albert.
Yeah, so I think all of us could hear him just fine, and then the panelists were receiving the question.
Sorry about that. Please proceed. Thank you.
Yeah, like I said, I sit in a very frustrating environment or a committee that has been selected to make South Africa a manufacturing hub for rolling stock to supply the rest of the continent. But one of the issues that remains unanswered is, will this trade work? Will this trade ever take off? This free trade that we're intending to implement, will it ever happen? If it's so, according to what you guys have identified and been through so far, how long will it take? And the next question is, we've been having most of the countries now already having trade agreements with, for lack of a better way, just call them colonizers. Most of the Francophone countries prefer doing business with France, and so is countries like Angola and Mozambique preferring to do business with either Brazil or Portugal. How are we going to make sure that some of these countries, when the trade comes in, if it kicks in, these countries can get off some of the trades? Otherwise, they keep on having these trades with international companies that invest in their countries and probably hold on to some of these things. And then there's a myth that some of these companies or these countries have 99-year-old contracts for those type of trade agreements. Thanks.
Another question, colleague. Yes. Does anyone else have a question there? Okay, gentlemen, can you maybe please, in the meantime, each one of you take a bite at Reginald's question? Tina, please go first.
Okay, so on the question of how long will it take? Okay, that's a very broad question. If you ask me, I think it's a very difficult question to answer, because I've got I think Donald has voiced some of his concerns with the AfCFTA, and I've got my own concerns, and mine is really around the politics. How do all these politicians from all these 55 member states come to agreement on these tariffs? So that's a very, and it's also this element where Donald sort of said it's politicians who are discussing this. You don't have business people discussing it. And if you remember back earlier on in my presentation, I sort of mentioned that this, to me, that this trade agreement is really it's a cherry on top, but it shouldn't be the igniter. It shouldn't be what catapults us to trading. It should be seen as something that, from where I'm sitting, if I'm to be honest with all in attendance, trade, we need to be trading as it is amongst African states. Yes, you need to look at, what are those duties so that you know whether it's a viable market for you to enter. And the AfCFTA should not be seen as something that, okay, we will only start when that comes into play. Because if we are sitting in 2030 and it hasn't come into play, I'm not going to be terribly surprised. I won't be. So I can see it taking 10 years, maybe even longer. But I don't want to put a bad omen that that it's not going to happen in the next 2 or 5 years. But you did ask me that question, and that's my opinion.
Okay, Donald, do you have a bite on that?
Yeah, I do. So I had a meeting with the negotiating team from the DTI towards the middle of last year, and I asked them a question: how long do they think it would take to reach agreement where even if we don't have a full agreement implemented, but we're at a point where, for example, the duties are starting to phase down, and they said best case scenario 5 to 7 years. So just kind of, I think that's been optimistic. I don't think I'm more in agreement with Tina that I think we're probably closer to 10 years, but that isn't the point though. And I just want to emphasize what Tina said. There's no reason that you don't need to have a trade agreement in order to trade. Just that sweetens absolutely everything, but you can do just fine without it. Again, if we have a look at North America, I mean that kind of got very interesting with Trump becoming president. But you didn't require NAFTA to have Mexico trade with the US, for example. But it did ramp up the trade afterwards, and things like the automotive sector really started to do well when the trade agreement was implemented. But it's not as if there was no trade beforehand. And so I think the way to perhaps approach the problem is if you need to identify the market that you want to take your product to, and whatever the economics of that decision is, generally the producer of the product maybe needs a little bit of help, but for the most part understands what kind of money they need to sell their product for in order for that to be feasible. And then the question is, well, what are the barriers to getting that product in? We very often, I find business feeling like, and it's not a South African phenomenon. We did a very interesting project in Kenya, and the behavior is quite identical there, which is people feel that things like duties are just things that happen to them. Kind of like the government determines what your income tax rate is or your VAT rate is. But it doesn't work like that with duties. So if you want to move your product into Kenya, then have a conversation with the Kenyan authorities, find out if they have an industry, and understand what the process is to get the duties removed on your product into that market. You don't need a trade agreement to go through that process. And part of the problem is people have a view that there isn't a process. It's almost as if you vote in the politicians and then they decide what those duties will be. But that is absolutely not the case. So I would encourage people, if you understand the market you want to get into, what are those barriers, and go after the market. If you're going to wait for the politicians to do their work, it just makes you a really naive business person. You should go out and make it happen. And there's no reason for me to think that Africans as individuals do not want to trade with each other. Yeah, I think you have governments that make that trade difficult. But if you want in, you've got to start the process of saying, this is what I want to do. There was an incident last year, and Ronnie, what I can perhaps do is I'll circulate the document through you and you can pass it along to everyone. But Zambia put out a notice last year saying, if you want to put your trucks through our country, you've got to have a Zambian driving the truck. And my brother-in-law owns a logistics company, and I actually called him and sent him the notice, but they put it out for comment. And, nobody comments. So part of the problem is these documents come out and then no one says anything. And then we all kind of go, oh my word, what they're doing is a terrible thing, but you're not a participant. And they didn't do what Zimbabwe has often done, kind of when you arrive at the border, the rules have changed. They published it, they went through a process. I sent it off to the DTI. I said to them, you guys need to climb in and do something here. You can't just kind of let this happen. I'm not sure if they ever did anything, but the point is, you've got to be an active participation in your own commercial space, rather than expecting, some bureaucrat or some politician to do the work for you. That would be my take. I think there's a lot of appetite within Africa to trade. And let me perhaps just kind of give a very pleasant example. I found when I was on this trip to Kenya, we were doing work for the World Bank, and I met a guy there, a Chinese gentleman, who had set up an enormous textile factory. And what he had done was he realized with the trade war with Trump that his access into the US was threatened. And so he took his factory and he stuck it in Kenya because of AGOA, you know, the African Growth and Opportunities Act. And he decided that it was worth doing and it was worth incurring the cost to train the locals to be able to work in the factory. And, you know, is that going to change the fate of the whole of Kenya? No, I mean, of course not. But it was one person who's not even African who took a look at this and said, there's a gap over here. Let me use this gap and let me get my product. And he made a substantial investment into the country. You know, we have to view Africa in the same way. Like, if you want these opportunities, then go after them. And perhaps just a closing point, Ronnie. So I hadn't actually thought about it, but AGOA is something that is very poorly utilized in Africa. And it's not the topic of this. I don't want to derail your valuable conversation here, but I think Africa has got to look at those big markets, which are opening up. You know, the US is busy blocking trade from Europe. They're busy blocking trade from China. And we've got a huge 5,500 tariff codes into the US with no duty out of Africa. And almost all of that is utilized right now just by South Africa's automotive industry. So there's huge opportunity, and we just need to go after it, I think.
Yeah, thank you, Donald. The mind shift, you know, that Tina was talking about, and what Alan Mukoki that we had a few weeks ago, Donald, the CEO of the South African Chamber of Commerce and Industry, and this leads me to a question. Is business complicit in their silence, you know, or in their rather non-participation? Because it's the same thing that Alan said when he was here. He said, in fact, his introduction, Donald, was to say that one of the biggest mistakes we commit is to think that business people are savvy enough to understand, you know, yep, the dynamics, firstly, but also understand the international trade environment. And he was actually making a call to business to come into play and take this space. So do you think that there's some form of you know, culpability on the side of business in that they are standing on the sidelines? It is the strangest thing ever, you know, that you're right. I mean, most of the time, and most of you would know this here, when you go to this, you know, multilateral institution meetings, whether it be BRICS or SADC, whatever, the first thing that hits you is that you're sitting with only government officials. And yet you're here to discuss, you know, economic development of a country. So would you say that to some extent business is to blame for this situation?
Yes, absolutely. I think we've created an environment which not always conducive to business participating. But having said that, you know, if you want to participate badly enough, you make a plan to do so. I think, speaking as a South African, and you know, the economy I understand the best, I think we're probably at a moment where we have to start asking whether institutions like NEDLAC have perhaps outlived their usefulness, and whether they now serve to rather hinder rather than help. And my comment here just comes on trade issues. I mean, I've no view on how well it works for things like labor and all the rest of it. But from a trade perspective, I've watched my life whittle away through NEDLAC meetings, thinking, what is everyone doing here? Because no longer does the organization or the institution operate in a way that's conducive to getting good outcomes. There's a value to having a seat at the table at NEDLAC. There's a value to being there, but once you can only put so many people around the table. And so, you know, what you then end up with is the deepest pockets, the people able to lobby the most effectively, get the biggest benefits out of it. So I do think there's a moment at which if we want trade with Africa to work, we have to ask ourselves, are the institutions we've created still the best way to do this? You know, why are we not better using technology instead of the very primitive way that we do this. We are not utilizing data, we're not utilizing technology to move these things along. And maybe, good outcome of, possibly the only good outcome of COVID is that we all now know how to use Zoom. We know how to have meetings, and maybe we don't need to fly people all over the continent to have conversations anymore.
Yeah, and also we know how to host webinars as well. So welcome to the future, I must say. Tina, do you want to have a bite on business complicity on this matter?
No, I think David pretty much covered it there.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you. You remind me of something when you're talking about the role that politicians play, and I think Donald captured it correctly to say they are there to create the enabling environment. So most of you know that I served 2 terms at ITEC as a part-time commissioner. And I want to give you an example, amplify what Tina said earlier on in terms of what the customs union is. So in terms of SACU in particular, which is the Southern African Customs Union, it's composed of the countries that we call BLNS, Botswana, Lesotho, Namibia, and South Africa. I think Swaziland also falls into the mix there.
Correct.
And it's basically a customs union with a common tariff, insofar as trading with the rest of the world is concerned. But I remember early when before being a commissioner at ITEC, I actually worked at ITEC for some point, and there was a time when I was responsible for making some additions on the SACU agreement. And when what the countries had agreed on was that each country was going to set up its own, a tribunal, so to speak, like an ITEC, yeah? So that is actually one of the things that is contained in the SACU agreement, but it has never happened. It's 20 years later. Donald, I think you mentioned that, the agreement was signed in about 2000 or so. So it's 20 years later now, and none of these countries have been able to set up their own, ITEC, for lack of a better word. And the reason is precisely what we're talking about, that we don't walk the talk as governments when we talk. Of course, the other countries may perhaps want to do this, but at the same time, they don't want to do it because it means a lot of responsibility for them. It means a lot of cost for them having to set up all these institutions. In fact, if you recall, the agreement itself talks about the SACU tariff board, which we still haven't seen up to today, and I doubt that we ever will, especially with the current, trajectory towards the continental approach. So it is really, difficult for governments to be in the forefront of, especially economic development. And I think we see it in most countries, where businesses are on the sideline, and we see what happens to the economies when there is no participation from businesses. I just want to check, colleagues, if there's any other question. Okay, this is someone from Daphne, and she says she agrees with Donald on the issue about the usefulness or lack thereof of NEDLAC, and that she's also not sure why they still exist. Are there any other questions that you have there, colleagues, related to our panelists here? Please feel free to pop in if you have a question, please. Thank you.
So I have a question. You mentioned, I think you said ITEC, and from Mr. Donald's discussions, I also gathered. I also sort of had the same question that you had about the culpability of the business. But so what I want to find out is there a body or an organization that exists to encourage and propagate trade, basically businesses taking up their responsibility? Is there, just like Mr. Donald suggested, that businesses should, it's not that hard, one needs to do research and find out how to conduct business. Is there an existing organization or body at the moment that facilitates or encourage such moves?
Okay,
Tina, I think that's more for you. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so most definitely, there's quite a number of different ones. Some are industry specific, but the Department of Trade and Industry is really that's what they do, and they do it quite excessively. What they do is there's trade shows that take place all over the world, and they have a program for each year. For the next financial year, they've already set it up the previous financial year, so they will know and set up which trade shows they'll be attending. Some will be in the US, some will be around Africa, some will be here in South Africa, Asia, different ones, and some are industry specific. And what they do is that export marketing plan that I was sort of talking about are what people use and sort of hand into the Department of Trade and Industry, and the Trade and Industry will assist and fund if they're happy with your application. And it's not like they're out there trying to block people from going. They've had situations, you know, where they can't fill up the number of businesses or entrepreneurs that want to go on these trade shows. So you'll find, you know, in a situation where there's, you know, 2 weeks to go before a trade show takes place, and they've only got 7 entrepreneurs and they budgeted for 20. You know, it's part of their objectives. So, like I'd sort of mentioned, even within the agriculture space, there's an export marketing department as well. So the opportunities are really there, and government does, you know, they do back them up. To be honest, I've seen some businesses where I didn't think that those businesses were ready for exports, and I highly doubt any exports took part after those businesses attended those trade shows. But that happens as a result of the DTI not being able to fulfill. Sometimes when they're sitting there and they've got 5 people and they're budgeted for 20, the next 3 people that apply, they're just going to get it, you know. So to answer, I don't know if that answers your question 100%, but they are DTI is the first one I would look at. And I'm happy to share as well, you know, the trade shows that was taking place this year, but obviously COVID-19 sort of came in place there as well.
So to add to that, I think you've also got private sector organizations like SACI, who you mentioned, who are absolutely trying to encourage companies to export. But I think we have a kind of a hangover from the past, which still haunts South Africa, and that is we spent a big chunk of time in our economy, particularly around the 80s and early 90s, with very, very high barriers around the country, very high duties. Companies like ISCOR, Sasol were protected from the realities of trade competition in the rest of the world. So I wrote a paper on this maybe 4 or 5 years ago on what we can do to grow exports of chicken out of South Africa. And I got such an astonishing blast in the media from one of the CEOs of the chicken companies who said, look, forget about exports. All we really want to do is just put up higher duties to stop the imports, and we can sell our product locally. The problem we have is we don't want the imported product in the market. Now, leave aside all of the emotive issues that happens around chicken all the time. But if your mentality is that really all I want my world to be is as big as South Africa, and just protect me from competition here, and I'm not going to do the things I have to do to sell into the rest of the world because it's just easier. That mentality is a problem. And I'm not saying it's pervasive, but I've run across it often enough. On the other hand, we're working with another South African producer at the moment and have been for about 2 years. And our objective there has been to say, you can only sell, there's only so many people in South Africa who can buy your product. For you to get any kind of growth that grows beyond the population growth rate, you are going to have to get into export markets. And they've put a solid effort in. And I mean, COVID has been devastating, but if you left COVID out of it, you know, they've moved from no exports 3 or 4 years ago to maybe 10% of their production volume being exported, but incrementally growing. And a lot of their trade has been into Africa. So some of it, yes, has gone into Europe, but a lot of it has been into Africa. And they've been competitive against the Chinese and the Indians and all the rest of it. Because when you're export focused, if that's what you decide you need to do, you start to change how you view your business. You start to think of, where am I going to cut the costs to be competitive? What are the things I need to do to move my product at volume, and they've been successful. So, you know, I think you've got to want it, otherwise it's not going to happen. And it's hard. I guess that's the other thing. It's difficult to trade. So, you know, if you want to do it, you've got to be prepared to put the effort in.
Okay. All right. Thank you for that input, Donald. Are there any other hands, colleagues? Albert?
There's none.
Okay, colleagues. I'm going to take the opportunity.
Sorry,
Yes,
Ronnie.
okay. Yes. Yes, Tina.
Yeah, just to close off on my side as well. One of the things that the examples were of the farmers wanting their chickens, you know, for duties to be increased so that chickens can't come into the market. See, these are the type of things as well that will also play a role within the AfCFTA. You know, some business people or certain industries may be sitting, a guy could be sitting in Tanzania and saying, okay, this one tariff code 7105/1990, if this is made duty free, what's this going to do for me? Yes. And these are the different conversations. And like we keep saying, you know, there's the business side and there's the political side, and they're not running on the same, they're not parallel to each other, you know, and these are the things that will cause a delay in this implementation.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, Tina. Thank you very much for that. Colleagues, I think I'm going, Donald, would you reconsider your last input as your you know, final input as well, or would you like to have a parting shot?
No, thank you very much, Ronnie. Appreciate the opportunity.
Okay. Great, thank you so much. Colleagues, thank you very much once again for a wonderful, you know, engagement and opportunity. As we mentioned, the reason we're doing this is because we want to be part of the platform that champions you know, the acceleration of the AfCFTA, and of course the acceleration of intra-Africa trade. So it's very heartwarming when you find that there are people that are interested in the same things as you are, and I'm very delighted for that. And of course, I'm looking forward to hosting you guys again in near future. Donald, thank you very much for your great input. Tina, thank you to you as well. I'm glad you've shared your details with the people who are in this forum today as well, and also to mention that if you want to get more technical in terms of your understanding, because remember what we are doing here, we're literally, you know, scratching the surface. There's much more technical information relating to international trade, and I hope you have noted Donald's details, because they do free training now, or technical training on some of the international trade law matters. I think today they were covering import and export control, and if your interest really lies in this, I think it would be worth your while to check it out. So the team from Media Fela, Albert, thank you as always for your awesome arrangements, and for everyone who attended, thank you so much for your time. And we're looking forward to engaging with you again in due course. Thank you and goodbye. By the way, we will share the video to those who requested. We'll share it via email to those who requested. So please, if you do need a copy of this, do share, send an email to us and we'll arrange for that. So thank you very much, colleagues, and walk safe to your lounge or wherever you're walking to now. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye, colleagues.